Hey, hi everybody, it's day 4.
Day 4, here we are again, and today we're super pumped because we are joined by one of our favorite teachers in the United States of America, Donna Santman. Yay, Donna.
Woo!
Thank you for joining us today.
You.
Donna is a middle school teacher. Tell us where you work.
I teach at 75 Morton School in the West Village in Manhattan. It's a new community middle school. It's a zoned middle school, returning to zoned middle schools in New York City. It's
And
a really big first middle school.
What does that mean, a zoned middle school?
So New York City is one of the first places in the nation, and my district in particular, to have school choice, public school choice. So kids, if you live in New York City, you apply to go to preschool, you apply to go to kindergarten, you apply to go to middle school, you apply to go to high school. So, so we are the return to neighborhood schooling. If you live in our zone, which is about 50 blocks long, and you want to come to our school, you can come to our school. And that's very unusual in my district and in the city right now.
Mm-hmm.
How many kids are in your school?
Almost 1,000.
Grades 6, 7, 8?
Right, 6 through 8. And this is our first graduating class, graduating in June.
How many students a day do you teach?
I only teach 3 groups of kids a day. My classes have about 33 kids in them, so not about 100 kids. Most teachers teach 4 groups of kids a day, but I coach. My 4th period is a coaching period, so I coach my colleagues on the 4th period.
So we thought it'd be a good idea to bring Donna into the conversation today because both Penny and I have learned so much from her. And Donna, one of the things we have been doing in these daily postings is we've been talking about a book. So I want to talk about this book.
Oh, good.
This is called Shades of Meaning, and it's written by somebody named you.
Thank you.
And I just want to say, you know, that I love this book for 3 reasons. Number one, it really gets into this idea of moving kids into deeper reading, interpretation, deeper levels of comprehension. Really, it's smart and it makes kids think. That's reason number one, and a very important reason. Reason number 2 is that it's done in a workshop mode. And it was one of the first books that I've read, you know, because I wrote a book of deeper reading, and I wish I'd read your book before I wrote that one. But it's, you know, the way that you, you know, adopted it into a workshop mode, I think is really, really interesting and fascinating, especially for those who say, you know, workshop is really more of an elementary school thing and not a high school thing, middle school and high school thing. And then the third reason is because you did this with middle schoolers, a universe that's very alien to me. And I don't know, I just love the book. It influenced my thinking a lot when it came out.
It definitely did mine. I had no idea who you were, Donna. And I read that book and had it on my shelf for quite some time before we met. And I was like, what? Oh, that's Donna Sandman. Like I always said it with like this author voice.
Well, thank you. I will say, Kelly, that I have used a lot of things from deeper reading in my workshop. So like teaching kids how to think metaphorically is a book club strategy. We actually, in our nonfiction book clubs that we finished a couple months ago, part of the stuff that I was showing you the other day, Penny, part of the work that kids had to do when they designed these newsprints that trace the development of ideas included trying to represent the central idea of the book that you read metaphorically. And that stands right on the shoulders of what you taught me.
Oh, that's cool.
So, Deeper Reading's a workshop book too.
Oh, thank you.
Wicked
Penny,
projects.
What book you want to talk about, Penny?
Oh, rushing us right along, Mr. Gallagher.
Yes.
So I think it's funny because you just gave me a lead in, Kelly. You said people think of workshop as an elementary model. So my antidote, no, is it right? Any rate.
Yeah.
Donald Murray. We've talked about him more than once. And I was really interested because I was reading this while I was waiting for you guys to get on. And Lucy talks about how going to New Hampshire, where Donald Murray was a professor of writing composition, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, that's who was their mentor. She and Don Graves were doing this project in elementary school because Don Murray created workshop teaching in college. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about teaching in a workshop. It's about teaching writers. And workshop teaching from Murray, this particular collection, which is my Bible, and I could find it because it has a white spine and I know where all my white books are, just saying, is articles that he wrote from 1969 through 1982. And it separated the part that I love about this book, the process of writing, writing for teachers, and the process of teaching, which is brilliant. As I'm going through it while I was preparing to do this book talk, I have one color the first time I read it. I have a different color the second time I read it. And then I have all these pages turned down. And as I leafed through it, I went, well, going on number 5 or 6 times I've read it. Lastly, Crafting a Life, an essay, story, and poem.
I was like the Brown book, the Murray Brown book. See, I can think in book color.
Right. And look at how thin it is. And it just really talks about how do you capture all of your life in, like, from before writing to starting writing to drafting, but across the 3, what he calls the central genres, essay, story, and poem. So I wish we all knew more Don Murray. And I have to say, in this book, one of the chapters is called Say One Thing. He revised that over time. In his 80s, he sent me a laminated thing that said SOFT, say one fucking thing. Just saying, that was Murray.
Okay, we'll be starting over now.
Am I not allowed to say that online? This is not like R-rated, is it? Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. So what are we going to talk about?
We're going to ask Donna what she's reading.
So I'm reading a lot of different things, but I'll tell you a little bit about what's going on in my reading life to show you what I'm reading. So I am having, I got a post on Facebook from a student of mine from a school I taught in the year of 9/11. I taught 2 blocks from the Trade Center that year, and she sent a post that, asking us to respond to what would you, after all these years, what would you say to kids now? She's now an instructor, I think, at Pace University, and so she's working with kids who feel their lives are falling apart. What do you wish you could have said to us? And I realized, having responded to that the main thing that I was thinking about in those days is how hard it is to get back into reading when my life feels so frenetic, when I feel unsure of what my daily life is. I picked up this the Nick Stone book that Penny brought to my classroom, and I keep falling asleep on it. So I went back to comfort food in my life. So I always pull poetry off my shelf, and so I last night pulled Valerie Worth, All the Small Poems, which is like a favorite, just dip in and be in love with poetry collection that are teeny tiny. I used to read them to my kids. I always teach them in an early notebook work. I always use them in an early writer's notebook. And then this book, Indivisible, which is about poems for social justice. And so mostly what I do is the same way I read essays is I open up, I do this. I don't look, and I go like this. And I then just fall in love with what I'm reading. So I could read Backyard. And that's how I'm sort of finding my way back into this crazy reading space. I also have mystery, which is the other thing that I do when I'm a Ruth Ware book, that when I feel myself, I can't fix my head, I put aside whatever I'm reading and I dig into poetry, something short, and mystery. So that's what's right on my shelf right now, or on my shelf. That's what I'm reading.
So maybe you could, there's so much that we've learned from you, but maybe we could just kind of in this short time talk about what are you kind of thinking about as far as your student notebooks? I remember coming into your classroom and seeing your student notebooks and just going, oh my goodness, I suck as a teacher, right? So, maybe just share an idea or two of what's been going on in your classroom regarding your students' notebooks.
Yeah. I would say that my notebooks have evolved a lot over the 28 years of practice. And I'm a very privileged teacher. I will admit that right from the very beginning. I never taught in any other way but workshop. I was, my teacher education was in reading and writing workshop. I went to teachers college and I taught in a workshop school right from the start. And so I always learned about notebooks as these collection bins out of which great works of art could come, right? I was taught to teach writing as the making of art. And so that idea is embedded in my being. And over the years, I've watched notebooks become less notebooky. You could almost feel the unit of study. You could feel the lessons that teachers were teaching across every notebook. Every page 52 was the same. And so 3 years ago, when I went back into the classroom, this is my third year back in the classroom after teaching, after consulting for probably, I haven't had my own classroom in 13 years. I went back to the classroom. One of the main things that I wanted to do was reclaim writers' notebooks. And so the thing that I decided to focus mostly on was the idea of the writer's notebook as an end in itself. It was not in service of anything but its own thing. And that didn't mean that there weren't seeds to be nurtured for writing projects, if I could use very old 1990s Teachers College writing project language. There are tons of seeds to be nurtured in there, and we do nurture those things. But the notebook as an end in itself became very important. And so that's idea number one. And idea number two that lives on top of that is that I teach my kids that the notebook can be seen as three things. We use our notebooks as collection bins, we use our notebooks as workbenches, and we use our notebooks as playgrounds. And at any given time, my kids are thinking about notebooks either collectively or individually as those three things. And that's become a kind of driving force. So the notebook doesn't devolve into some diary. It always is, as an end in itself, it's lifted up as a work of art, and in those three ways. So that's sort of the big stuff that's on my mind.
So talk us through, like, in your classroom in a day, how do you know which of those three elements kids are working, and do kids make that determination? Is there a required balance between those three elements of your notebooks?
I wish I was that good, but no. I'm not that. I'm not that. I guess I'm not that structured as a teacher to think about it. I just keep holding up all these many plates. I'm not really that interested in turning that into rigid curriculum. I think that the way that I think about it is I tend to teach writing in like strands of lessons. There's three kinds of curriculum going on in my room. There's the kind of the curriculum of the unit of study. It could be a reading piece or a writing piece. There's the curriculum of living a reading life, and then there's the curriculum of living a writing life, which is your notebook stuff. And the curriculum of living a writing life lives in like strings of lessons. And at any given time, I develop a string of lessons. They could be 4 lessons, they could be 8 lessons, and they lean on any one of these things, collecting, playing, or workbench. More often than not, they're a workbench thing or playing thing. I think the kids don't need at this point much collecting. Every once in a while, it's like, how many of you can't figure out what to write in your life? And so we'll return to that. But more often when I'm really in a string, it's something about using your notebook as a workbench or something about being very playful. And I'm always running to the other side of the ship. Like wherever we are too much, I'll swing to something different.
Can you say a little bit about what you mean by a workbench?
Yes, a workbench is like craft, like you're working on any idea in trying to work on the quality of your writing. And so sometimes they might be things like I'm very invested in kids understanding the way that a piece of writing could go. That typically what I think kids do is they come up with a topic, they take a big deep breath, and they just keep thinking about sentence by sentence by sentence, what should they say next until they run out of things to say. And in middle school, that's usually about 3/4 of the page, 3/4 of the way down. They're like, I'm done. And what you notice when you read that writing is that there's a kind of back and forth, and that's what they get stuck in. So they say something too fast. They don't give themselves time to develop something. They don't know the turns that you could make in a piece. They don't know that you could start with a little story and then raise a question about that story and then try to explain what you mean by the question and then go to another piece of information. Like, they don't know that stuff. And so sometimes when we work on in a strand of workbench lessons, it might be just the shape of writing. And so I lean on everybody else's work. I don't invent anything like that myself. I basically borrow from what everyone else did and reframe it into the ongoing curricular conversation in my class. So this might be everything from looking at a bunch of mentors that have really beautiful structures that you could imitate, that are very clean, to borrowing Gretchen Barnaby's kernel structure stuff and teaching a few of those that I think are high leverage and have a lot of payoff, to anything else that anyone's ever said about structure. And so I might do 5 weeks of lessons on structure. And I think of that as a workbench kind of thing. You're working on a craft. It might be, like slowing down the moment is a craft thing. That might be a workbench kind of thing. Any craft move that I want to linger in for a while that has high payoff.
It seems like a month ago, but I was in your classroom the 5th and the 6th, 2 weeks ago now. And what I noticed, because I got to confer with kids on notebooks and I got to be there when they were given this wide open time to work in their notebooks. Take one kid who showed me the periodic table and had been for some time, these pieces of writing based on one of the elements. So he had the elements pasted in the periodic table in his notebook, and he was on whatever element he was on that day. And I was flipping through it and talking to him and saying, what are you learning from doing this? And it was definitely, his mindset was, this is like his own string of learning. And he is just trying it on. And he kept saying, my parents want me to go for, what was it, an E?
Whatever. They want to get 100.
They wanted to get 100, whatever. Which was about completion, kind of like the way Kelly and I talk about it, your practice.
Absolutely.
And yet, then I sat down next to a girl, and I did, because her notebook was filled with sketches and words. And, talk to me about how you use art in your thinking. And she said this most profound thing, that I won't be able to find the exact words, that sometimes she sees it in a sketch, in a picture, and she can't write it. So she sketches it so that maybe she can find the words. But she said it in very different kid speak. But it was really cool to listen to her talk through what was she doing with her notebook. Yeah. Another kid had written a very different thing every day. Like, they were going back through 4 or 5 entries just to talk to me about how they were using their notebook. There's such freedom in what you talk about.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. When I listened to you both talk about, your conversation the other day where you were talking about how if you don't tell kids if you tell kids it's not going to be graded, or if you don't tell kids what they have to do, they'll do so much more. And, I guess my feeling is, I don't really care. I mean, I'm just going to be really honest. Like, for Enzo, if his driving force is, my mother wants me to get an E, and I'm this thing, and I'm going to figure this out, I don't really care. He's doing something interesting in his notebook. And I feel like there was a moment in my teaching where all we ever did was teach kids out of what they were doing. They're reading too much fiction, give them nonfiction. They're writing too many times about their brother, get them to write about something else. All we ever did was teach them out of it. As if somehow writing about your brother 50 times in one part of a school year was so much time. Most writers write only about the same thing all the time. And if Enzo spent this whole year writing about the periodic table, that's not a terrible thing for 1 year in a life that I hope is, reaches for 100 years of writing. I really, maybe it's my cynicism, maybe it's my exhaustion. I'm tired of the same conversations for years and years and years. And I feel I feel so privileged that I get to just be a teacher right now. And I just get to lean in and do my things. And I could ignore any one of those, like, yeah, Enzo, whatever. If you're doing it because your mother wants you to get 100, have at it, keep writing. I'm just not going to talk to you about that. I don't care. It's a very funky, privileged place I get to be right now. And it's getting me to think differently, because I would not have thought about what Enzo is doing as something valuable. I would have worried about the ways he was talking about it, or it's so rote, it's so this. No, you're like in this cool independent writing project. Keep going. You'll get out of it. In the same way that kids get bored after they've read the same book 80 times, the same kind of book. I'm done with this writer because now they're formulaic. You'll get out of this periodic table. Maybe it'll be ninth grade. I hope you're still writing.
And so
but it's the ownership and it's the agency that you're really teaching the kid.
I think so.
So would you say that like his kind of extending that thinking with that particular topic, is that what you would call the playground element of your notebooks?
So what would I don't feel like Enzo's being that playful in what he's doing. If you read them, they all kind of sound the same. I feel like he's collecting pages about stuff he knows a lot about, and he's in the process, the conversation that I tend to have with him fairly ineffectively, actually. If you read all of them, they don't get that much better. But when Enzo and I pull alongside and talk, I often talk about if he read them all, how is he improving his ability to explain stuff he feels like he knows a lot about? Mm-hmm. And they're not that much better, but he can say things that he thinks makes them better. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that's a little more workbenchy, but that comes from me, not from him. He's just like in a zone.
You know what I love about you, Donna?
I'm sorry.
Sorry. What I love about the way you think about teaching is that you think a lot. You did this with writing the mentor text study they were doing as well. You think about how much of this is me, the kid just mimicking what I said or my thinking, and how much of this is actually learning, where the kid is beginning to generate thinking based on the exposure to these things that I'm giving them. And I don't know that teachers think enough about that.
Yeah, and what does it look like for a 13-year-old to think? We're kind of obsessed with being so deep. I said it the other day. They're not so deep. We're not so deep. Most of us are fairly ordinary. Let's embrace just being beautifully ordinary. Like, you're really into the periodic table. Have at it. Write everything you know all the time. That's cool.
You know what, though? This exact thing happened. Do you remember when you asked me to go to their timelines? So the kids are studying whether or not classics should be classics. And they're reading these books, a lot of them that are too hard for them. The very ineffective conference I had about Jane Eyre and Charlotte Bronte and then Jane Austen, I was like, but this one kid we talked about, because he said, I can understand it, but I'm struggling with the thinking. And you and I talked about it later, how in his understanding, I know the plot and I know the characters. That's understanding. But I'm having trouble with the thinking, because what we call understanding is, the big ideas, the theme, the development of, and he was like, I'm not there and getting that part. And what I loved is you were like, but that's all the place he needs to be right now. He's got what the book is, but he's really not ready to create some sophisticated categorization of the big ideas and that's just knowing those kids and not saying you should be here.
Right. And also that work to me is very playful.
Yeah.
I do feel like kids learning how to play at being these kind of uber literary thinkers or play at thinking symbolically. That whole world of even what I believe about teaching symbolism or teaching any literary element is very anti-authoritarian. It's really about, you do that because it allows you to see possibility where you hadn't imagined possibilities before, not because there's some authoritarian answer to that the dove means peace. You know, that you know, it's the invention of the light bulb. That's why we teach symbolism. You got to see a possibility where it doesn't exist. And if everything is always what it literally says or what it literally is, how do you imagine possibilities? You know, so it's 8th grade. They're little. Let them play. Who cares if they're wrong, right?
So maybe say a little bit more about the playground element of your notebooks.
So it started a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, with Scout. So Scout is a kid in my class who I've never watched a kid. I had 2 kids last year, same way. I never watched a kid work so hard and not generate anything. Like, she could stare at a screen, a blank for like she could stare at a notebook page. She could stare, and literally, and she was trying something that she could not articulate, but she just couldn't generate anything. And then I don't actually remember how it happened, but Scout had, I would love to be able to find it. Scout had opened up her notebook at home one day and had taken a flower, these petals from a flower on a plant, and had decoupaged them. There were probably 100 of these teeny tiny flowers, leaves, across a page in these very like pristine and precise rows. And in the middle of it was a photo. And it was the most profound piece of work that certainly she had ever done and that I had seen happening in these notebooks. And I started asking her about it, and in her very Scout way, she kind of shrugged her shoulder, like, I don't know. What do you want me to say to you, Donna? I don't know. You know, they're middle schoolers. They think something deep, and 5 minutes later, when you refer to it, they're like, what are you talking about? I didn't say that. Like, you know, and so I made something very big of it. I showed every one of my kids, and I started talking about composition. And I said, you know, this is an act of great composition, and I'm going to offer up this tremendous invitation for all of you to stand on Scout's shoulders and use pages to learn about composing. And then across a series of days, I both brought in a bunch of materials, origami paper and different kinds of markers and all kinds of things. I brought in ripped up text, like a book that had fallen apart. Like, what can you do with this page of somebody else's text in your notebook? I brought in all kinds of stuff, and I started talking to kids about composition and why I believed that kind of work would have great impact on their writing itself. How thinking about how to design a page is something that you can do in a variety of ways and could transfer into other kinds of things. And really beautiful things started to happen in places that were not surprising. What was surprising were the kids whose notebooks were mostly empty, who were now filling notebooks because they felt invited to get credit for a page. We could talk about volume and requirements and grading. Get credit for a page having simply designed 3 interesting words in the middle of the page. Like that could be writing work for them, and thinking about what color they would use and whether they would be in caps or whether they would be in block and where we'd go on the page. That was so freeing for many kids who had only ever seen me write paragraphs down the page and couldn't imagine how they would do that in their notebook. And all of a sudden, Cosma is filling 2 and 3 notebooks a year, where she barely could have 3 pages for the first 3 months of the year. That was profound. And that to me was playing. And all we talked about for months was that kind of play.
Didn't you turn that into a year-long study of design for grade 7?
Yes, it became about halfway through the year. For the whole rest of the year, it became about design design. How will you design a page? How will you design it? And it bleeds because I moved up with my kids, and about a third of them to about 40% of them, well, actually, I would say about 60% of them have had me before. And there are about 30 or 40% of them, this is their third year with me. I just pull everything. I just act as if you've all been with me all the time, and I just pull everything through. And I just say, catch up, talk to someone, catch up. When they look at me like they don't know what I'm talking about. I'm like, yeah, you were there. It was fine. Just catch up. They're little. Stop taking ourselves so seriously. They're little. You all have the hard work.
It's big
You
things.
gotta get my kids into college. They're little.
Oh my gosh.
I know we're kind of running up against our time, but can we say maybe, and Penny might not like this, but can we just say a minute or two, like how do you assess them? Do you assess them? Do you grade them?
I grade notebooks. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So I grade notebooks for 3 things. I count pages. I have a volume expectation, and you have to have this many pages to get, we do standards-based language. To meet standard, this many pages to exceed. And so I definitely grade that. So for every grading cycle, I count your pages. I actually believe in what I call notebook conventions. I think because kids write in their notebook more than they write anywhere else, I expect them to practice decent conventions. So I don't check every page, but across the whole thing, are you regularly using capitals, periods, and paragraphing? Those are the 3 that I care about. And I really care about paragraphing. If you're not regularly paragraphing, I knock you. Because I think that's very foundational. Even more than sentence stuff, we can do some work in paragraphing. And the third thing, I ask you to pick one entry in the grading cycle that you want me to grade for craft, that you think you've done something interesting here, and we talk about, how it's good writing. And we've talked a lot about what makes it, specificity is the thing I'm most after. So how specific?
And if I remember right, it's not A, B, C, D, F in your room, right?
No, it's E, M, A, N, and X.
You got to continue there.
Exceed standards, meet standards, approaching standards, not yet, and X means it's missing. The only way that you could fail at my school is if you don't do your work. Once you start doing your work, you pass. 65. Yeah, you can't fail.
You say in a grading cycle, how long is that?
If I was really ambitious, they'd be about 2 weeks, but mostly they're 3. 3 week long. Every 3 weeks, I grade all your notebooks.
You rotate the classes, or you really just?
I used to do them like you were a blue Monday, a red Tuesday, a green Wednesday, and I'd be looking at notebooks all the time. This year, it just became too cumbersome, so I have a grading week, and I've learned how to grade a set of notebooks really fast. I can do a class in a day. My preps and after school, and I can count really fast. And then I lean in on your craft.
Mm-hmm. So do you ever prompt their notebook writing? Do they write in class, or is it all at home?
Both. We have times like when you were in, we hadn't been in notebooks for a while because it's that dang testing season. Yay, no testing. Dang testing season. So I feel somehow like I'm not responsible if I don't address that. So I sucked up my writing teaching. In my notebook time. I mean, I have other writing teaching that we're doing, but my notebook time in that. So it had been a few weeks since I'd been teaching in notebooks, but I still expect kids to keep up their notebooks all the time. Like, I'm going to collect them. I don't care that you haven't been. And I said to a class, like, I'm stealing myself for your notebooks. I think they're going to be empty. We haven't talked about notebooks in a while. And they were gorgeous. They were just gorgeous. I was blown away. Not the class that you were in. I was totally blown away. But we'll go in strands. In a very typical cycle, I have 6 periods a week. I do 3 periods of reading and 3 periods of writing. And so depending upon what we're in, there's often a lot of strand of notebook stuff in those writing periods, and sometimes it's a project we're in that I'm teaching into. I don't do that many what would be called units of study.
I don't have an answer.
Sorry.
I don't have an answer either. But Donna, if people want to know more about you and your work, where would they go?
Oh, that's so hard. I know, because I'm not on Twitter except as a follower. You know, I have a Heinemann book. I'm on Facebook. I'm happy to be a Facebook friend. That's probably the extent of my social media. I am an Instagram follower only because I'm a mom. Probably Facebook is the place to really find me, but I don't post professional stuff. I post my family.
And
So
so you're in the midst of writing another book, so we may have to
I'm
wait.
in the midst of writing another book. Yes. That's a book about shared reading in middle school.
Awesome.
Well, I would say that my personal and professional life took a turn for the right direction when our paths crossed in that fateful year together. And every time I hear you talk, I just am writing and writing and writing big ideas down. And so we thank you so much. And we miss
thank you. It's such a treat to hang out with you two. Really, as a teacher, really, I'm so grateful that the two of you are doing this. It has fed me for the last couple of days. And I just love that you are so giving of yourselves all the time. All the time.
Well, not all the time, but thanks.
All the time.
Definitely not all the time. Thank you, Donna. Thank you so much for helping us out.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you soon.
We'll see you next time. Thank you so much. Bye.